So as many of you know, I recently had the privilege of being a guest on Matt Fradd's Pints with Aquinas podcast / YouTube channel, and I finally have been able to listen to it all the way through. And as I did so, I was a little bothered by something, which is that Matt kept asking a question that I would start to answer, and then maybe the conversation would head in a different direction, or maybe I just didn't feel confident in answering it to the extent that it required. But whatever the reason, I don't feel like I answered it adequately. So after having given it some more thought, I wanted to try to answer it again now. So the question was, what do we do now? And what he specifically meant was, in examining all the discouraging and distressing news in the world, and specifically in the church, with the synod, with corruption scandals, with the rehabilitation of known serial abusers in the church. Because if you're in the habit of paying attention to church news, which I am to some degree, and Matt would be as well, there's just so much that could cause someone to lose their faith or their hope. And so what should we do about that? What should our response as lay people be? And I don't think he meant what should people with a platform do about it. I think he just meant, what should your average pew-sitting faithful Catholic layperson do? And I would start by answering that we need to create a healthy and reasonable buffer between us and all the toxic news that is shoveled in our direction from all over the world. Because God created us with natural limits as a kind of mercy, I think. He placed us in a world and in an environment in which there are limits on how many things can preoccupy our attention, right? Just by the physical limitations that he gave us as a provision. There are only so many people you can encounter, so many things that you can hear about, and there's only so many things that you can actually learn and retain. It's like we've gotten to this point where we are inundated with news and events that are so remote from us that we have no firsthand knowledge of, and yet we're supposed to make that our top priority and register our opinion about it and spend all of our personal time talking with our friends and families about these things. But most people can't remember their next door neighbor's name, let alone anything important about their lives. Like, doesn't that seem ridiculous to you? Because of media and virtual technology, we've broken through those reasonable limitations that God granted us, so that our very limited minds are drifting through this overwhelming landscape of tragedy and provocation on a scale that is so unreasonable that we have no hope of retaining any of it. And even if we try, the next thing has already replaced it in our attention. And then on top of it, we're expected to form some sort of an opinion about these events that we know very little about, as if that's going to help make it any better. Most of these problems are bad enough without attention deficit afflicted people with the most superficial understanding of the circumstances all sounding off about who are the bad guys and what should be done about it. Not only is the quantity of information overwhelming, but we are also coerced into fixating our attention on a certain flavor of information characterized by misfortune and scandal. This was actually one of the things that was Chesterton's complaint about journalistic media, that they exclusively focus all of their attention on tragedy, which left the reader with the impression that the only significant news to report was the catastrophic kind, when in reality, these are the exceptions in the world we live in. Like, you'll never hear a headline about Mr. Jones who went to work and then safely returned to his family to enjoy a restful evening of leisure, which is the kind of thing that occupies the vast majority of events that take place in history. So they have to find leads and search far and wide for the bad news, leaving us with the impression that the world is nothing more than tragedy and corruption, and that this insidiousness, even though it is actually most of the time very remote from us, is actually pressing in upon us all the time. We can't even enjoy the peace and tranquility of our own lives when we have it, because we are inundated with every piece of bad news that can be scavenged from every remote part of the world. And I just don't think that God intended it for us to know about every disaster, every detail of every war, and every misfortune that befalls someone somewhere out there, not to mention every scandal and abuse that happens in the church. There's just far too much that no reasonable person can help despairing if that becomes their daily diet. It's corrosive to your soul, and again, by reason of the natural limits that God created for us, it's obvious that He never intended for the scale and quantity of all the world's tragedies to preoccupy our minds at the expense of the joys of our own lives. And frankly, just knowing about all the bad news in the world is often so futile because there's literally nothing you or I can do about most of it. God gave you authority over the jurisdiction of your local life, your relationships, your family, your job, your contribution to your parish. No amount of chirping on social media about some remote war or some remote bishop who lives far away from you that you only know about because someone else reported it to you, likely someone with an opinion and maybe even an agenda of their own, will fulfill your obligations to God and your fellow man. It's all just a distraction from the good that you should be doing right in front of you. Now, I'm not saying we need to bury our heads in the sand. There are degrees with which it is good for us to know about things that are going on in the church and the world for that matter, for those of us who care, and to not allow ourselves to just be taken for a ride by activists who have no love for God. But I don't think we should be in the habit of scrolling through social media in order to join in on the flame war and to form opinions about people we only know about because some editorialized report reached our attention. So what I would recommend is checking in from time to time to have some reasonable idea of what's going on. Read an entire article from some reputable news source to get the full context. Don't just scroll some social media feed and think that you've informed yourself. Feeds they're designed to be addictive, which means that they pacify your mind so that you aren't even in a condition to receive that information and process it critically. And then focus on the good that you and I can be doing rather than feeding the social media machine. And I would suggest that we should be focusing this energy on becoming as philosophically and theologically literate as possible. Because in a time when we have good and strong shepherds in the church, we who are the flock, we don't need to lead and protect ourselves. But in a time in which they are negligent in their responsibilities, we do have to lead and protect ourselves. And the way that we do that is by informing ourselves about what it is that they are supposed to know and use while they govern and protect us. And I'm not celebrating this fact. This is a compromise, but it's a compromise that the shepherdless people are put into. Now, I'm not trying to say that we should act like we have episcopal or apostolic authority or to try to supplant the authority of bishops. And I'm also not trying to say that every bishop is corrupt, but it seems apparent to me that enough of them are that out of love for the church and our families, we need to devote ourselves to studying the teachings of the church, the catechism, the doctors, and trying to understand our intellectual tradition and how it can be applied to our lives today, including our political participation. We have to stop falling for this narrative that the church has no political wisdom to offer. It absolutely has a very rich history of applying the natural and theological virtues to our civic life. And the only reason we are so easily persuaded by the claim that it doesn't is because we've been so complacent in our duties to be fluent in our own tradition. We've had good popes for a long time, and they've done a good job of setting the tone for the rest of the church, and so too many of us have allowed ourselves to put our feet up and to relax, but that's not going to cut it anymore. And that's a tone I want to set on my channel. I may, from time to time, discuss current events insofar as they might be alarming the faithful who might need help reconciling the news with their faith. I'm a layperson who is struggling to know and understand what it means to be Catholic amidst the storms inside and outside of the church. So if there's some news that is jeopardizing your hope or your faith, and it's something that I've been able to work through in my own mind, I might share with you how I'm doing that. But the majority of what I want to be doing with my channel is to bring attention to the kinds of knowledge and insights that we as Catholics need to be fluent in. I'm studying up as best I can, and then I'm sharing what I learn with you. And yes, I'll admit it can get clumsy at times, but even if I'm not the best person to be teaching you what you need to know, I hope that I will at least bring attention to the topics and themes that we should know about so that you can then go study it and learn about it for yourself. And I know it's stimulating and it's exciting and it feels like you're accomplishing something by watching the next YouTube video that exposes all the corruption of the world for you. But I'm convinced from my own experience that we need to place reasonable restrictions on that kind of content and focus more on correcting and fixing ourselves rather than just reveling in the faults of others. Because if we spend all of our time preoccupied with the faults and tragedies of others, then we won't have an appropriate amount of attention and time to spend getting ourselves into the intellectual condition we need to be in when we're in such confusing times. And I know that hot takes and scandals would get me more views and subscribers, but I know it's not good for my soul, and I don't think it's good for yours either. And if we care about the good of the church, we have to devote our limited time and attention to learning what we need to know in order to lead when there is a deficit of leadership. And that's what I intend to dedicate most of my attention to on this channel. And I hope that you will join me in that effort. So forgive me for saying something that should be kind of obvious, but we as Catholics should be looking out for one another in the secular world. And I would say especially in the business world, in the professional sphere of our lives. And I don't think that we do this enough. Catholics should be using Catholic businesses for their goods and services. Catholics should be hiring other Catholics. And Catholic business leaders should be supporting and collaborating with one another, especially in a time when the values and the winds of the world are not blowing in a very sympathetic direction. This is what Fisher's network is trying to build, a network of Catholic economic leaders who can establish this kind of landscape for Catholics to better support each other. We form groups of business leaders at a parish level so that they can establish rich friendships and then help each other grow personally and especially professionally. And then once having shored up one another's economic success, they can turn their attention to better supporting the needs of the parish and the community at large. And pastors are joining these groups too as chaplains in order to help provide spiritual direction for the economic leaders in their communities, but also to get the business mentorship that they need so that if there's an HR issue, a construction issue, or a financial concern, they now have a network of business leaders that they can turn to for advice and support. So if you're a Catholic business owner, an executive, an artist, a politician, a school administrator, or a leader in any other professional capacity, consider starting your own crew or joining one now by visiting fishersnetwork.com.